Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and today we have a video guide for you, and in this video guide today we are looking at your motherboard's EFI, or as it's previously been known, the BIOS. So this guide is for all of you out there that are either too frightened to enter the BIOS at all, or you have very limited knowledge of it and you don't really want to go around tweaking all the wrong settings. But for me, the BIOS should be a place that any PC enthusiast feels very, very comfortable with. There's lots of useful settings in here to make sure that your PC is running optimally and as cool and quiet as possible. It's also a place where you might want to come if you want to update the BIOS, for example, to get new features, better stability, or even to support future processors. So it's an important place for any PC enthusiast to feel comfortable and at home, and to come on a regular basis to make sure their PC is running better and as efficiently as possible. So the guide today is not going to be about running through and describing every single setting in the BIOS. It's also not going to be about overclocking, because I've already done overclocking guides for Intel and AMD's current platforms, which you can see in my other videos. Definitely worth checking those guides out, because you can get more performance for free using just a couple of clicks. Very, very easy to follow, and they've got lots of great comments saying how simple those guides were to follow as well. So definitely check those out if you're up for a bit of overclocking. So what we'll be doing is running through various settings where you can make sure that your PC is running optimally. We'll also be looking at the fan control suite, which is my favorite part of the BIOS, and how to make sure your fans are configured properly. And we'll be looking at things like how to update your BIOS as well, which is important to do because you want to make sure that your PC is running as stably as possible and that it supports future processors. So lots of things to get through, and we're going to make sure that your PC is running as optimally as possible by the end of the video. So first of all, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you found this video informative. Don't forget to like and comment down below as well. Always interested to hear what you guys think of my videos, and subscribing to my channel and turning on those notifications just gives me your support. And if you found it especially valuable, then you can always buy me your coffee or send me your thanks in the description below as well. So that's it. Let's crack on with the video. So we are going to start this video at the front page of an MSI BIOS, and as I mentioned earlier, you can probably use this guide to navigate other BIOS versions or EFIs from other motherboard manufacturers, but this is specifically for an MSI EFI. So if you have a modern MSI motherboard, then your EFI probably looks a lot like this. Now, MSI has introduced a recent BIOS update, and I noticed that compared to the original BIOS that I had on this motherboard that looked quite different to the one that's released today. So the old BIOS was about a year and a half old. Updated it and it looks slightly different. So when you boot in, it now looks like this. Now, if you have an older BIOS or an older motherboard or something like that, it might look a bit more similar to this one. So I've just switched the screen to advanced mode there, and this is potentially what your motherboard BIOS might look like. But we're going to switch back to easy mode, because that's what your motherboard BIOS or EFI will probably look like now if you've updated it, or if you bought a brand new motherboard, or you've bought a brand new system with an MSI EFI installed. So that's what we're looking at here is the front page. So we're just going to run through a few of the settings here, so you can just go through and look at everything as it is on your own PC as well. So you can follow along on your smartphone perhaps and boot into your EFI and do those kind of things. But first of all, we need to actually get into the EFI. So what I'm going to do is just briefly come out of the BIOS, and we're going to restart our PC. So just ignore that notification for a moment. So what you need to do is just restart your PC or power it on, and pretty much give it a few seconds to start booting. But as soon as you've gone through a couple of seconds, you want to start tapping the delete key on your keyboard, and I'm doing that right now. And eventually what will happen, you might see a screen come up that tells you about boot devices and all that kind of stuff. Just keep on gently tapping the delete key every second or so, and eventually you will get back into the BIOS. So we've got an AMD motherboard here. It takes a bit longer on AMD motherboards to actually do that loop and get back into the BIOS, but eventually, sort of 30 seconds later or so, and we're finally getting the boot going, and we should be in the BIOS in another couple of seconds. So just waiting for that to happen. And here we are. So this is the front page of your MSI BIOS. So once you've tapped the delete key relentlessly for 20 seconds or so, this is where you should end up. So as I mentioned, this is slightly different to the older version of the MSI BIOS, but this is what it looks like now. So we're going to run through what information you've actually got here and how to use it and interpret it. So to start with, top left hand corner, we've got the current CPU speed, which is obviously the default speed of our AMD Ryzen 5 7600X 6-core processor. And over on the right, you can see the actual specifications of the processor, or the model number of the processor as well. So DDR speed is something that you need to probably mostly concern yourself about in the BIOS. This is the main reason a lot of us will be coming into the BIOS, is to make sure that our memory is running at the correct frequency. So our memory speed is 6400 megahertz, and that's obviously what is shown here. So our memory speed is running at the correct speed at the moment, but what we're going to do in a minute is how to double check that your memory speed is running at the correct frequency. And what we'll do is look at the various different profiles that are enabled, because what probably will happen is when you boot up your PC, especially if it's a new build, your memory won't be running at the right speed. So we're going to check that and how to set it to the correct speed in just a moment. So now if we move over to further over to the right side of the screen, we've got a few more bits up the top. We've got the CPU core temperature, which is super important, because if this is running at like 80 or 90 degrees and you've just booted into the BIOS, that could indicate a problem. Now, the first thing to check is that your CPU fan speed is actually, or the fan is actually running on your processor cooler. If your processor temperature here is 80 or 90 degrees, that could indicate that the fan cable is not connected. Now, it's very common for CPU fans to actually shut off sometimes on some with some coolers on some PCs if the CPU temperature is lower. So just because the CPU fan isn't spinning doesn't mean that there is a problem. What is a problem is if the CPU temperature is 80 or 90 degrees when it's basically at the BIOS and not doing anything. The next thing to check or double check is that you applied thermal paste. Not applying any thermal paste could well see the CPU temperature overheating. And also the last thing to check is that you removed the protective plastic film from the bottom of the processor cooler, whether it's an AIO liquid cooler, a water block, or a heatsink cooler. There are usually protective thermal or protective pads on the underside of those that protect the bare copper, so you don't get scratches on it. Very, very easy to forget to remove that, and that can have a catastrophic effect on your processor temperatures when you've got a slither of plastic between the processor and the cooler. So those are just things to be aware of if your processor's temperature is very, very high. But by very, very high, I mean 80 degrees or above. Now, the motherboard temperature here is just that. It's a temperature sensor on the motherboard itself, kind of indicative of what your case temperature is. So may or may not be useful depending on whether you're planning on adding case fans and those kind of things. The V-core is the CPU voltage, which you probably don't need to worry yourself about unless you're overclocking and that kind of thing. The other things we need to be aware of are over on the far right here of the motherboard or the motherboard EFI. We've got the make and model of the motherboard, or at least the model number here. So that can be useful when you need to identify the right BIOS, because you'll need to go to the exact product page on your motherboard manufacturer's website and download the BIOS. It can also be useful if you want to sell your motherboard or something like that and you don't know exactly what the model name is. Obviously, if you've bought your motherboard, that's probably written on the box, but not everybody has bought it. You might have bought a new system or bought one from a friend or something like that. So the CPU we've got here is listed as well. So we've got the exact model number of our CPU, in case you've forgotten, and the memory size as well. So worth checking that you've got the correct memory installed. We've got 2 sticks of 16GB DDR5 memory installed, so this should be 32,000 megabytes or 32 gigabytes, and that's exactly what we've got here. So the problem that you might have is that one of the sticks might not be recognized, so you just need to maybe turn your system off, unplug it, put it back in again, and hopefully it should register the full amount. The next thing we've got down here is the BIOS version. So this is the latest version for this motherboard EFI. So what we'll be doing in a minute is running through how to update it if there is a newer version on the website. So BIOS or the EFI is basically the brains of your PC, and updating it can mean extra stability. It might mean more compatibility with more memory modules, or it might even allow your motherboard to support future processors as well. So it's kind of important to keep it up to date. If your system is running absolutely fine, it's perfectly stable, in general, you don't need to update your BIOS, but it's still worth doing it just to maintain future compatibility with components such as processors. So we'll be going through how to update your BIOS in just a moment. Now, the BIOS build date will give you an indication of when the BIOS was released. As you can see here, it was released about a month or so before this video went live, and this is the latest version. Now, when I got this motherboard, it actually had a BIOS that was about a year old on there. So it's a review sample. I haven't updated it. I've just got it back on the test system. So it was pretty old, and I'd actually gone through the process of creating this video, and when I updated it, I saw that the BIOS, or the front screen that we've got here, had changed completely. So I needed to redo the first part of this video because the BIOS now looks quite different, as I mentioned earlier in the video. So that's it from the top side. The other things that we've got moving a bit further down is the CPU game boost. So you don't really want to touch that one because it's kind of like an automatic overclock for your CPU. It can make it run a lot hotter though, so it's not worth doing that. You want to check out my overclocking guides, which you can see in the description, if you want to try any very easy overclocking. So best to leave that button alone for now. Now, this is where things get interesting, and this is a feature that you would definitely want to know about. It is the XMP profile. Now, this is kind of the same thing as AMD EXPO, and that you can select from one of several profiles for your memory. Now, on most motherboards, profile 1 is the one that you want to select, because that is the one that will force your motherboard to apply the correct speed and timings for your memory and have it running at its optimal speed. So what may happen is when you boot up for the first time, it might not be set to the correct speed. So what you'll need to do with your MSI BIOS specifically is click on the memory option here. And as you can see here, the option is already set correctly to profile 1, and we've got our correct speed of 6400 megahertz. Now, the thing that you will want to be aware of is that when you come in, it probably won't look like this. It will probably be running at 4800 megahertz, which is the default DDR5 setting, basically. So essentially, it might be set to profile 3 just as a failsafe. So the first thing you can do is click on memory. And if you're not sure which BIOS, or which profile you need to set, you can actually click on the memory option on the left, and it shows here what speed each profile is running at. So you can see that our memory needs to be running at profile 1, which is 6400 megahertz. And you can see what speed your memory is by looking on the side of the memory modules or on the box if you've bought it yourself. Now, if you have stability issues, when you set it to 6400 megahertz, or mega transfers a second as it should really be called, what you can do is actually select option 2, which actually dials down the frequency quite a bit by about 400 megahertz. So that may or may not fix your stability problems. If you continue to have stability problems, what you can do is knock it down a further notch and all the way down to 4800 megahertz, which has fairly lax timings for that frequency as well. So that's always worth trying if you have stability issues. You're just knocking back your memory, see if it fixes the problem. So for us, what we want to do is just make sure that our profile is set to 1. So that's what will actually happen. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that even when you're switching between profiles, the current DRAM frequency won't change. So we're currently set at profile 1, which is 6400 megahertz. That won't change until you reboot your PC. So what might be useful here from MSI is to kind of give an indicated memory speed frequency of what would actually happen if you tweak a certain setting. That would potentially be useful here, but that doesn't happen. You need to be aware of what each profile means. So we need to select profile 1, and then away we go. Now, some motherboards just have an instant click for XMP, and it will select profile 1 as standard, and then you reboot and hopefully everything is okay. That can work, but personally I prefer the option of having these settings, because it means that I can easily select from different profiles to do some stability testing if I have stability issues. So that's all we need to know around there. So that's what we've got up here with the XMP profile, and this will obviously change if you drop in an AMD EXPO set of memory that's optimized for AMD systems. So over here, we've got boot priority. So that should be just as it sounds. You've got a whole bunch of different devices probably connected to your PC. You might have an SSD, you might have a hard disk. For your data storage, you might be wanting to load Windows from a USB stick that you've just created using the Microsoft Windows Media Creation tool, and you've just downloaded Windows 11, for example. So this is where you can select your USB stick. So what you do is just find your USB stick, which is probably this one, and you drag it over to the left, like so. So the left is your first boot device, and over on the right is your last boot device. So that's an easy way of changing your boot devices. If you want something that's a little easier maybe to look and to change the order of your hard disks, then you can actually go into the advanced section, which we'll do a little bit later. So other stuff that we've got here on the front page is an indication of what stuff is actually installed. So here we can see that we've got our two memory modules installed in slots, basically slots 2 and 4. And then we've also got the profiles that indicated for our memory, as we spoke about earlier. And if we head over to the left side and we click down a notch, we actually get the storage. And this will show you all the storage devices that you've got installed on your PC. So this is super useful if for some reason you get into Windows and you find that your hard disk isn't listed. You can come back to the BIOS and it will show you what is actually connected to your PC. So you know whether it's a connection or physical problem. For example, you might have just not plugged the cable in properly, or your hard disk might have died, or whatever. If it's listed in here, it's more likely that you just need to activate it within Windows or initialize it or create a volume with it or something like that. So super useful. And here you can see we've got a single M.2 SSD installed, and this is our shiny new crucial T700 PCI Express 5 SSD installed, and we can see the size of it as well. So heading down to fan info. Now, this is where you can view the fan information, but you can't tweak too much. What you want to do if you want to start tweaking things is either click on the little cog dial here, which is for the settings. That will take you straight through to the fan control center, which we're going to look at a little bit later. Or you can just go to the advanced settings and click on the fan control suite. So if you go to advanced, you go to hardware monitor, and that would do the same thing. So we're just going to head back to the easy mode, which is probably what you found. Personally, I do kind of prefer the advanced mode for myself, just because it gives easy access to all of those settings. But for now, I'm going to stick with what you guys have probably got as well. So the help section just gives you a kind of an at-a-glance view of some of the more basic features and what each section actually has in it. So that may or may not be useful to you depending on what you've got. So another thing I kind of like is the favorite section. So if you go to a setting in advanced mode, for example, we'll just go and quickly do this now. So here we've got the AMD or the XMP profile, not AMD EXPO, XMP. So we've got the ability to select from those profiles. So we can obviously do this from the front page, but if you want a bit more of a detailed option to tweak the frequencies and those kind of things, for example, the actual frequency down here, we can select from anything. You don't want to select anything that's faster than the memory that you've got though. So say, for example, we wanted to drop it down. We were having stability issues at 6400. We just wanted to maybe try dropping it down to 6200. We can do that, but a quick way of actually getting to that setting, and you can do this for any setting in the BIOS, is to right click and apply it to a favorite. Now this is super useful because what you can do is, if we just go back to our favorite section again by clicking on easy mode up here, if we go down to our favorites, you can now see that favorite 1 is listed in here, and here it is. So it's a really quick way of adding a whole bunch of favorite options, and you can actually select it from here as well. So it doesn't just give you a shortcut to that where that setting is, it actually gives you direct access to tweaking that setting. So you could have a whole bunch of stuff in here. You could have favorites. So you've got, if I can just go back, no, it's not letting me do that. I think I've got to press escape. Yeah, there you go. So you've got up to 5 favorites to list in the BIOS. So you might want to have one that tweaks a specific fan speed. You might want to swap your boot devices. You might want to disable or enable your onboard audio. All those kind of things, you can actually do that kind of stuff from your favorites. So if there's just like maybe 4 or 5 settings that you regularly use or you want easy access to do, this is a great way of getting easy access to them. So down on the bottom left, we've got hardware monitor, and this is, as we said before, it's just your fan control suite. So there's a couple of ways of getting to that, and one is your the fan info here. You can just click on the little cog dial. You can also click on hardware monitor. You can also go to advanced and select hardware monitor from there as well. So at a glance view in the fan info section, you can see the fan speed of your CPU fan or your pump as well, and also all your system fans. Now, if I quickly switch over to, here we go, fan 5. So we've got a fan on our fan header at the moment. If I just yank that out, literally straight out of the motherboard, I've done that. And what you will probably find is that that fan speed has dropped down to 0. So it's a real-time view. So you don't need to reboot your PC when you install a fan. If I just reconnect it again, hopefully on the same fan header, and hopefully in a second or two, we should see that fan speed start ramping up again. So just going to wait for it to go. Yeah, so there we go. So this is like a live view of every single fan header in your case. So you don't need to reboot your PC. You can plug in fans at random while your PC is basically in the BIOS, and you can see what speed they're running at. You can configure them. You can get them running at different speeds. It's super cool. I really love this feature. So down on the bottom, we've got a few other things that you might want to be aware of. If you've got a discrete sound card, you probably want to head down to the south end of the EFI like here, and we've got the HD audio controller. If you've got a discrete sound card already, an external sound card, you want to disable this by just clicking on it. That will free up memory and system resources because you don't need both system sound controllers enabled at the same time. It could also prevent problems in Windows and issues with games and stuff where they don't know which sound controller to use. So it just makes your life easier if you disable the onboard sound if you have a your own sound card, like either one that you plug into a PCI Express expansion port or an external sound card that connects over USB or something. So we're going to leave that one on for now because we're going to use the one on the motherboard. So the rest of everything else you don't really need to worry about. Everything should be ready to go with Windows 11 out of the box. The other thing you might want to notice is RGB lighting control. If you don't want any RGB lighting at all, you can actually turn it off by clicking that button. So just worthwhile mentioning that won't be on every motherboard, but it's on this one, so I thought I'd mention it. So that's pretty much it from the front page. So we're going to go ahead now and look at some of the other settings. So here we are at our motherboard manufacturer's product page for our particular motherboard, which is the MAG X670E Tomahawk Wi-Fi from MSI. So what you'll need to find is the specific motherboard product page for your motherboard. So that will basically mean that you need to get the entire name exactly as it says on the box. So for example, there might be a different model that sounds the same but lacks Wi-Fi. Whereas your motherboard might include Wi-Fi. You cannot use the BIOS from the non-Wi-Fi version on the Wi-Fi version of your motherboard. It probably won't. Just will refuse to install it when you go to back to the EFI to install the BIOS. So this is what you need to do. Just make sure you get the exact product name exactly as it says on the box, and there will be a page dedicated for your particular motherboard on the motherboard manufacturer's website like we've got here. So the next thing you need to do is to find the support section or the download section. And here we can see there's a whole bunch of stuff. There's lots of drivers, utilities, and all sorts of things. Drivers, you might want to check some of the things that you can find here, but in general, Windows Update is usually pretty good at keeping your system up to date in terms of drivers and those kind of things. So obviously, if your sound card isn't recognized, your onboard sound, this is the place to look for those kind of things as well. But we're more interested in the BIOS. So let's click on the BIOS here. And as we can see, there's actually a BIOS dated just a couple of weeks ago, actually, as this video was being made. So that's obviously a lot newer than the one that we've got on the motherboard, which was actually dated in 2023, I believe. So it's over a year old. So we want to download this file, and then I'm going to run through exactly how to download it. So we are just going to grab that file now. And here you can see that we've got our BIOS file. So it's in a folder at the moment. You'll just want to double click on that. And then the actual BIOS file is this one here. So that is basically what you want to do. And we've already got a USB stick lined up down here. So you can see it's completely empty at the moment. That's generally the best way you want to do it when you find a BIOS, because you could be searching for a while in all the folders looking for your BIOS file. So it just helps if you have a blank USB stick. Doesn't need to be very big. 2-4 gigabytes is absolutely fine. If you've got a spare one lying around, great. If you do have one with a load of other stuff on it, you can use it. It just might mean that you have to spend an extra sort of 10 or 20 seconds trying to find the BIOS file. So what we're going to do now is just go back, find our BIOS file, and just drag it onto our USB stick. So that has all transferred across. Double check our USB stick, and there is our BIOS file. So that is all you need to do. You don't need to rename that file or anything else if you're updating with the EFI. Or the BIOS. The one thing that you might need to do is if you need to update your BIOS without a compatible CPU in the socket and use USB BIOS flashback, you may well need to rename this BIOS. So check your motherboard manufacturer's name for how to update that BIOS basically. And as you can see here, MSI actually has a guide on how to use mFlash, which is its version of USB BIOS flashback. So it's pretty easy. You just need to rename this often to something that the motherboard will recognize and update automatically, and away you go. So what we're going to do now is go back to the BIOS, and we're going to install the brand new version that we've downloaded from MSI's website. So in order to actually update your BIOS, you need to drop it onto the USB stick like we've just done, and then you need to restart your PC, enter the BIOS, and then enter your motherboard's BIOS or EFI flashing tool. So that's what we've done here. We've just clicked on mFlash at the bottom left-hand corner of our MSI BIOS screen, and that has taken us to the page that we see here. So if you have a different motherboard manufacturer EFI, then the process might be slightly different, but in general you just need to drop that BIOS file from the product page onto a USB stick, find your motherboard manufacturer's BIOS tool, click or tell it that you want to update it, and away you go. Sometimes you need to restart your PC. We did with MSI, it does that all automatically. Other motherboard manufacturers just update it straight away. So with MSI you have to restart, and that's where we're at now. So the next thing you want to do is click on the BIOS file, and it will ask you if you want to select that one. If you just want to make sure, you can go back onto the product website and just double check that this is the right file name, especially if you've got lots and lots of files on the USB stick already. So we know that this is the right BIOS file because it's the only file on our Kingston Data Traveler USB stick. So we're all good to go with this one. So here we can see the BIOS is updating, and we are just waiting for it to finish. Probably 5 minutes or so from start to finish, and that's pretty much it. That's all you need to do. It's all automatic, and in a moment our PC will restart. So we are back at the EFI, and what normally happens when you restart the PC after a BIOS update is that it will just continue straight through to Windows. So obviously if your settings have been wiped like ours have here following the BIOS update, you will need to manually go back into the BIOS. Okay, so here we are in the hardware monitor section, which is where you can control all your fans. So there is another way to control your fans. It's a much more detailed, much more complicated way, just going through the actual BIOS settings, but that's why graphical user interfaces for your fan control like this are generally where you should be, because they're designed to make the whole process a lot quicker and easier, and I absolutely love them. So the whole idea behind one of these things is that we have different fan headers on the motherboard. So we've got our CPU fan header connected here, and one of the things I really love about it is this is real time. So if I just go ahead and connect another fan on one of the system fan headers, you will see that system 5 fan header has just fired up, and we have an RPM reading for that as well. So there is a whole bunch of stuff that you can do in here, but the main one that you want to tweak is the smart fan mode. Basically, if you click on this one, what will actually happen is you have these little balls or circles that you can play around with on the screen. So you'll notice that I click smart fan there, so turning that off. If your motherboard restarts, it will probably automatically detect the fan and do what it needs to do. But our fan is a 4-pin PWM fan. So the first thing that we should talk about is the settings over here. So PWM and DC. So DC is basically sending a voltage to your fan, and that's it. But what you want to do is PWM, because PWM actually sends intermittent voltages, and it can actually result in a quieter operation, and it also allows your fan to spin at lower speeds as well. So definitely want to make sure that your case fans are PWM if they are 4-pin. So you want to make sure that they have 4 pins on them, and that means that they are PWM compatible. If they're just 3-pin, then you want to use DC mode because that will send a direct voltage to them. So we are now in PWM mode, and we can click on smart fan mode, and we can actually select all the different points and those kind of things, and not too much else available if you are doing anything else, but you can select the actual fan speed if you just want to have like a set speed if you turn smart fan off. But I much prefer having it on, because what this allows you to do is do cool stuff like this. Like you can actually have it at 0 RPM if you have it all the way down there. So for example, if your system is pretty cool running, it's like a massively high power system, or you just have an air conditioned office or something like that, you might want to just have the fans ticking over really low speeds like we've got here, and then having them increase once the CPU temperature reaches a certain point. So the CPU temperature is what we've got on the left here. So as you can see, our fan has now dropped to 0% or 0 RPM. So that's what we're dealing with here with this fan at the moment. So it's completely silent, not spinning at all. But if our CPU was to hit a certain temperature, and the temperature is down the bottom, you can see if you're moving the balls, you can actually see the temperature. So we're looking at the bottom one, which is Celsius. So say for example, our CPU temperature reached 60 degrees, which we've got there. The fan speed would start to increase. So we can play around with the other balls. We can maybe limit our fan speed. So for example, we don't want it to get to 100%. So eventually it will top out, but it will only top out at 70%, which is what you can see there on the left panel. And you might want to do that further down the range. So you might want 70% fan speed, which is on the left, from maybe the same point. You can just have a square graph. So at 60 degrees on the bottom for our CPU, it actually dials up our fan speed to 70%. So that's a pretty cool way of customizing your fan speed. You can do everything in real time, and it just helps fine-tune your PC so you can get it running much cooler and quieter. And then you can go back into Windows and you can actually alter the fan speeds using MSI software, or you can just run some benchmarks, see how it performs, come back into the BIOS and do the same thing. Now, something else that's super useful, and not many motherboards actually can actually do this, MSI is one of the one that can, is to select the temperature source for the fan speed. So obviously by default we have the CPU temperature dictating the fan speed, but you can pick another point on the motherboard. For example, if you want to have the case temperature, the system temperature dictating the case fan speed, which would probably make much more sense, then you can select system, and that will now adjust your fan speed based on the system temperature. So the system temperature down here, as we can see, is about 33 degrees. So you probably need to play around with it a bit yourself, but that's half the fun of this thing. If you are more concerned about the VRM temperature, that's the MOS down here, the MOS. So you can select MOS from that drop down instead. So that will, for example, if you've got a roof fan and you want to make sure that your VRMs are being kept nice and cool, then you might want to select the VRM or MOS temperature down here. And again, you'll probably want to monitor this in MSI software or hardware monitor or something like that, seeing what temperatures it actually gets up to, because it's all very well adjusting it to temperatures, but if you don't know what those temperatures are half the time, it's kind of pointless adjusting your fan speeds to any specific temperatures. So that's all pretty cool. And if you just want the system to do its own thing, you can go down here and just select all default, and it will kind of adjust everything back, and it will adjust your fan speeds accordingly to various settings and doing its own thing, really. So that's pretty much it for the fan control section. There's not too much else to go in here other than the step up time, which is basically how quickly the fans will go move up and down. So if your CPU temperature is fluctuating quite a lot, you don't really want your fan speed to be flying around all over the place, because it will just generate a lot more noise. The tone of the fan will be changing quite a bit over time. You don't really want that. You just want your fan speed to sit as it is, and having it switching back and forwards all the time isn't going to do your cooling any benefits either. So if you increase the fan step up time, that will actually slow that curve, give it more of a curve, and it will just gently ramp up fan speeds. So that's a pretty cool thing. And step down time is the same thing, but in reverse. So you can adjust how quickly your fan speeds ramp up and how quickly they ramp down. So if you want to extend that, it might mean that your system's a little bit noisier for a little bit longer, but you won't just suddenly have a massive drop off in the fans, and it will be a much more constant noise. So lots and lots of cool stuff here. If you have a water cooling pump, you can control that from here as well. You probably want to have that running at full speed all the time, because a lot of AIO liquid coolers do benefit from being run at full speed, but also you can tune them back. You can see how well they perform at lower levels if they are PWM compatible, and a lot of custom water cooling pumps are compatible with PWM as well. Okay, so we are in the final section of this rather long video now, but hopefully you found it informative so far. And don't forget, you can use those timestamps to go back and forwards through the video. So it's not designed to be a super quick look at a BIOS. It is designed to be somewhat in-depth and giving you a good description of the settings that you need to know about. So we are going to go into the advanced section now by clicking on F7 on your keyboard, or by hitting on the advanced tab at the top where our mouse is right now. So clicking on that brings up my favorite view of an MSI BIOS or EFI that looks a lot like, well, will look like this on your motherboard. So we've just got easier access to a lot of the settings here. So the final two tabs that we're going to be looking at are the OC profiles and settings. So settings is where you're going to find a lot more things that you can tweak to make sure your PC is running optimally, and OC profile is a very, very useful tool for saving your settings. Now, we obviously save the settings when we press F10 and exit, but if you click on OC profile, what you can do here is save every single setting that you have tweaked in the BIOS. It takes a snapshot of the BIOS as you've tweaked it and saves it to a specific profile. You can then switch to another profile. For example, what I've got here is one profile for high fan speeds if I've got an overclock running or it's a hot day or something like that. And I've got one for low fan speeds, which I can probably run in the winter, or if I'm just running my PC at stock speed and don't need all that extra cooling. So if I know that I'm going to be watching a whole bunch of stuff on Netflix over a weekend or something, I can load this profile when I boot my PC. I can have a super cool and quiet running PC. And if I know that I'm going to be gaming for the whole weekend and pushing my PC to the max, and it's 30 degrees outside and I don't have air conditioning in my PC room, which we don't generally here in the UK. I do in my office where I am right now, but don't tell anyone. This is what you can do. So we've created two separate profiles here. I've gone in and tweaked all my fans to make sure that they are adhering to whatever profile that I've got here. So high fan speeds, I've obviously got the fan speeds running a lot higher. Low fan speeds, fairly self-obvious. So what we can do is basically you've done all your tweaking in the EFI. You want to save your profile. You can even save it to a USB stick if you want to back it up. We've got 6 profile slots to choose from. What we can do now is just click on a vacant profile if you want to save it. We can then click on the name, so set name for overclocking profile 3. We'll just call it profile X. Hit enter, and as you can see, we have created profile 3 as being called profile X, and you can then save it. And if we just exit out of that, we can now see that profile 3 is called profile X, and that has all our new settings saved. I didn't actually change anything, but you get the idea. So that's a super, super cool feature to have, and it's one that I use quite a bit because I run lots of different tests on my test motherboard. So one of my motherboards does case testing. It also tests SSDs and all those kind of things. So I just load different profiles from its EFI to cater for those different test scenarios. So it's super, super useful. It saves you a whole bunch of time going through and tweaking everything manually every time you change something. So that's overclocking profiles. We are now going to go into motherboard settings, and this is basically a bit more involved compared to what we've got earlier. There's just lots of options, but we're just going to run through some of the ones that you should be aware of and just skipping the ones that we don't really need to go into too much detail on. So we'll run through each section though, just giving a brief description. System status, fairly self-evident. I think you get some details about your processor down here, and also the BIOS version. You could obviously see a lot of this stuff in other sections as well. Perhaps a bit more useful is seeing what devices are actually plugged into the SATA and M.2 ports. So you could obviously do that in other sections as well, but if you find that one of your SSDs or hard disks isn't appearing in Windows, the first thing I would do is come back here and see if it's actually present on the system and it's been detected. If it hasn't, you might want to check your cables or potentially try and test that device on another port or even in another PC if you still can't get it working, because it could have been dead on arrival or something like that. So I'm going to exit out of that one because it's fairly self-explanatory. The advanced section here, so it's the advanced section of the advanced section, and we're going to go into the PCIe subsystem settings. So BAR support, I'm not going to run into a whole load of detail about what that is, but it's basically resizable BAR. Essentially boils down to you getting slightly higher frame rates in some games. So it's a little tweak that both AMD and NVIDIA have enabled. And if you find that in your driver for NVIDIA or AMD graphics cards that this isn't enabled, or GPU-Z if you use that software, if you find that for some reason BAR is not enabled, you might want to come into the BIOS and check that it's enabled here. Now, I've not changed this at all. This was enabled by default, so you shouldn't need to change anything, but it is worth checking if for some reason BAR is not enabled, because you'll be losing out on a handy boost in frame rates. Now, also to do with PCI Express and all that kind of jazz are the basically the PCIe gen modes, the speed or bandwidth or generation of PCI Express 5 that's enabled on the various ports. So on the MSI MAG X670E Tomahawk Wi-Fi, we have the primary M.2 slot supports every single generation of PCI Express that there has been. So we've got a Gen 5 M.2 SSD in there at the moment, the Crucial T700. So that thing can dish out data at over 12,000 megabytes a second. But if you need to, for whatever reason, you can actually dial this back. Now, obviously, I wouldn't want to do that with this particular SSD because I'd be massively curtailing the speeds that I've paid a premium for. But there are situations where you might want to do this. With an M.2 SSD, for example, you might want to dial back the generation that's available to the slot to give you more PCI Express lanes, but more specifically, places that I've done it in the past are for the primary graphics slot. And the reason why you might want to do this is that there's not always that much of a difference between Gen 4 and Gen 3. And on a case I had a while ago, I think it was an NZXT H1 Mini ITX case, it had a PCIe riser cable in there, so I didn't have to physically connect the graphics card to the motherboard. It could be bent round at an angle using the riser cable. You might have seen those used in quite a few cases now. Now, the riser cable was limited to Gen 3 speeds, but my motherboard and my CPU, or motherboard and my graphics card, should I say, were actually able to run at Gen 4 speeds. However, there was a Gen 3 riser cable stuck between them, and when you mix those three components in that combination, your system goes haywire. I was wondering what the heck was going on. There were thousands of comments on Reddit about the same thing. Turns out it was the fact that you're trying to run a Gen 3 riser at Gen 4 speeds. So what everybody had to do is they had to go into their BIOS of their motherboard, their EFI, do exactly what we're doing here, and drop it back to drop their graphics slot back to Gen 3. That solved the problem until you could get a PCI Express 4 riser cable, which were hideously expensive at the time, but now they're included as standard. So I'm going to switch that back to Gen 4 because I want my graphics card running at Gen 4. You don't generally lose too much speed by doing that, dropping it back to Gen 3. There's probably no reason at the moment why you'd want to do that, unless you've encountered the same situation that I'm in and you don't want to have to buy a new riser cable. Just be aware that it might hit your frame rates a little bit. So everything else is fairly self-explanatory, and the lane configurations are probably not that useful to most people, but if you've got a motherboard with multiple PCIe slots, you might want to drop some of them back. I know this was popular for cryptocurrency mining. You just wanted everything at the lowest speed possible, so you could run multiple graphics cards in all 4 slots or something like that, so probably not that useful to most people. So that is pretty much all we need to go through in that section. ACPI settings, nothing really interesting in there. Integrated peripherals, you get access to most of this stuff from the front page. If you want to create a RAID array, that's what you can do under the SATA mode. And the HD audio controller, we've already looked at the option to do that on the front page, whether you want to disable it if you've already got a sound card. So the integrated graphics section, this is where you can switch between your discrete graphics card and the integrated graphics on your processor. So if you know that you're going to be using the integrated graphics all the time on your processor, then you just switch it to IGD there, which is the integrated graphics. Everything else pretty straightforward and automatic. You don't need to tweak anything in there. The USB section, don't need to touch anything in there. Power management, don't really need to touch anything in there. You don't need to touch the BIOS options on that one. Secure erase might be useful if you want to wipe an SSD before you sell it or get rid of it. Traditionally, it was just used to kind of wipe the SSD and regain some performance back in the day for very old SSDs, but it is still quite useful. Now, the MSI driver utility installer, this is included, or something similar is included on lots of motherboards these days. Basically, when you get into Windows and it detects you have an internet connection, it will download and install, or well, it will ask you if you want to download and install various things to do with your motherboard, such as the motherboard software utilities that can control your fans and overclock from Windows, drivers, etc., etc. I'm inclined to, I'm 50-50, I think, on this one. It's useful to grab some of that stuff without having to go to your motherboard manufacturer's website. On the downside, it can potentially lead you to installing a load of bloatware. So I generally let Windows Update install my drivers and all that kind of stuff that I need, and then I'll get things that I specifically need from my motherboard manufacturer's website. So it's up to you whether you do that. If you want everything installed and you want to have a play, then by all means go ahead, but generally I would say just get the things that are absolutely essential to you, whether it's RGB control for the RGB lighting for your motherboard, etc., etc. Get it direct from your motherboard manufacturer's website and don't enable this thing. So I would probably disable that one, I think. So the last section that we're going to look at in the advanced section is AMD overclocking. Now that's why I actually use this motherboard in the first place, because this is a separate section that has a bunch of extra features. So the OC section allows you to do a manual overclock. It allows you to do various different types of overclocking and that kind of stuff, applicable to both Intel and AMD. It allows you to tweak the multiplier, set the voltages, overclock your memory, deal with lots of power settings and all that kind of stuff. AMD overclocking has its own different section for a few specific things. So you have to accept the damage waiver. That's absolutely fine. You can go ahead and do that as long as you know what you're doing, of course. And here we have a couple of important things I wanted to mention. So first of all is Precision Boost Overdrive. We're going to go in here. So Precision Boost Overdrive can improve the stock speed performance of an AMD processors. This kind of works obviously with this motherboard with Ryzen 7000 processors, and what this will do is it will allow it to hit higher frequencies if your cooling is good enough, usually with the all-core overclock. So it doesn't often result in significantly higher frequencies on one or two cores, but it sometimes does boost the all-core frequencies, which may help games a little bit. More improvement you'll probably see in content creation. So that's probably worth enabling if you know what you're doing. Loads and loads of great guides on the internet about how to use that. Perhaps a slightly more involved but even more rewarding is Curve Optimizer. So Curve Optimizer can allow you to tweak the basically the frequency and voltage curves for your processor in kind of a similar way that you tweak the fans. So if you've got more cooling on tap, the processor can actually go a bit higher, but it can also rein in the voltage. So if you want to try and get your processor running as cool as possible, what you might want to do is to reduce the voltage to have this as a negative option, and this way you can actually end up with slightly lower voltages. If it's positive, you can increase the voltage and potentially hit higher frequencies. So there's a lot of detail here that I'm just literally scratching the surface on. There are lots of good videos out there for Curve Optimizer with AMD Ryzen CPUs. Definitely check those out. I've only just scratched the surface here, as I say, but it can result in a much cooler running processor, and as we know, Ryzen 7000 series processors are quite hot running. This thing can make a big difference, so definitely check out some guides out there on how to use Curve Optimizer. But this is the section where you find it. So you need to go to settings, then AMD overclocking, as we can see here, and then click on that, accept the damage waiver, and away you go with all the extra tweaking, which I've found very, very useful. So we're going to go back to my favorite screen now. That is it from my hardware guide here today, tweaking the BIOS or EFI of an MSI motherboard. Probably applicable to lots of other motherboards as well, but mainly with MSI. If you found it useful, do let me know in the comments, and also you can buy me a coffee as well, as I mentioned earlier, if you found it useful. And if you have any questions about your BIOS, if there's a setting that I haven't covered that you want a bit more information on, or a bit more information on a setting that I have covered, or you want to know how to do something specific, do let me know in the comments and I will try and help you out. As always, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It means a lot to have your support, and don't forget to turn on those notifications as well. So that's it from me today. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to check out the timestamps as well if you want to go backwards and forwards through the video, and that's it. I will catch you soon.